I think we'll get started now. It's been a tumultuous week. I hope you've been able to get some sleep in what has already been a challenging semester and time in general. My name is Shiloh Krupar. I'm a Provost Distinguished Associate Professor in the Culture and Politics program in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, and I'll be moderating this event. I'm just going to keep these opening remarks very brief. First, I want to thank the Mortara Center for International Studies at Georgetown University for hosting and sponsoring this event. Thank you to Mortara Director Abe Newman and the center's ongoing support of innovative scholarship and books. Thank you to Jenna Zabara for her administrative assistance in setting this up and conducting our webinar today. My thanks also to the Culture and Politics Chair, Kate Chandler, and the Culture and Politics program for co-sponsoring this event. And finally, thank you to all of our panelists today who join us from 3 different institutions. So I'm excited about the convergence around curiosity studies. So we're here to talk about the book, Curiosity Studies, A New Ecology of Knowledge. The book is published by the University of Minnesota Press, and it's also open access on Manifold. We have with us today the 2 co-editors and contributing authors, Perry Zurn, Assistant Professor of Philosophy at American University. Also Arjun Shankar, Assistant Professor of Culture and Politics in the SFS at Georgetown University. And with us also is contributor author Christina León, Assistant Professor of English at Princeton University. More detailed bios can be found in the invitation to the panel and also on the Mortara Center's website. So I believe the structure today is to turn it over to Dr. Shankar to provide a brief overview of the book, followed by each panelist, Drs. Zurn first, León, and then Shankar, offering comments on their chapters in the book. And then we'll open it up to the audience for Q&A with the panelists. So I'll stop there and invite Dr. Shankar to take over the mic and get us started.
Well, thank you all for being here today. I know I'm just refreshing my New York Times voting thing all day, so it's a testament that we have so many people in the crowd. Thank you, Dr. Krupar. Thank you, Mortara Center, Culture and Politics program. I'm hoping that some of the things that we talk about today can help us think about the moment we're in and maybe how we should ask questions about the moment we're in. And in some ways that's a way of getting into thinking about curiosity studies. And I'll just very briefly explain what Perry and I were thinking about when we sort of staged this conversation between 12 different scholars and 12 different disciplines on this idea of curiosity studies. And it started because I think we both had this awareness and maybe even an anxiety about how curiosity had been studied so far. So mainly curiosity as this sort of universal framework, singular, right? We all have a similar drive when we have a gap between what we know and what we don't know. And in that particular definition of curiosity, it forecloses any sort of way of exploring difference, right? Different types of curiosity across different populations. And I think for us, what we were really aware of and what we wanted our scholars to sort of interrogate was the politics of curiosity. We wanted to say, and this is maybe the first point here, that curiosity is always embedded in relations of power and is historically contingent. And so the way to study curiosity really is by asking a question, something like, who is curious about what, when, and why, right? And I'll just give you a couple of examples of this, right? We know that, for example, in the civilizational moment, the colonial moment, right? The cis het white man was seen as the person who possessed the right disposition to be curious, right? They were rational, they were reasonable, and therefore they're the ones whose questioning capacity was seen as valuable too, right? They could organize the world, as we know very clearly historically, that they could decide who knew what, et cetera, et cetera. So in that particular sort of moment, the colonizer is the only person who has the capacity to be curious. At the same period, and there's a great chapter in our volume by Barbara Benedict who talks about cis white women at the same period in the Victorian era, whose curiosity is basically seen as unruly, dangerous, right? And this means, of course, that curiosity has to be curtailed, limited, right? Really destroyed, because it might bring down society in some way. If we sort of speed up time and think about the modern period, maybe, Ta-Nehisi Coates talks about a similar phenomenon in his book, Between the World and Me, where he says that the schools in which he was cared more about his compliance than his curiosity. Now, what does that mean? That just means that within a particular kind of carceral education system that he inhabited, Black boys who are already seen as potentially criminal, right, cannot be curious, could not be curious. Instead, their curiosity must be curtailed and delimited. So that sort of brings me to the second way that we sort of think about curiosity studies, which is to think about it within institutional arrangements. So if curiosity is always political, we have to think about how different institutions, specifically institutions of higher education, curtail or facilitate curiosity. And that's one of the reasons why we wanted 12 disciplines, right? Because every discipline has a different regime of knowledge value, meaning different types of knowledge are valued, right? And therefore different kinds of questions can be asked. But even maybe a little more pragmatically than that, we can think about undergraduates and their requirements. Let's take the School of Foreign Service, for example, right? School of Foreign Service has requirements for every student who goes to the school. One might that we know very clearly are econ requirements, 3 econ requirements per student. So what does this tell us? Well, it tells us, one, that economics is a type of knowledge that's valued. It also tells us the kind of questions that students should be asking, right? And what perhaps they're not allowed to ask. We can't question necessarily this regime of value, or if we do, we're challenging the constraints imposed upon us by the system. So that's the second kind of way of thinking about curiosity and power, right? Within institutional arrangements. And the last way, I'll finish up here, is to think about how we enact our curiosity, right? What I mean by that is, when we're thinking about curiosity as singular and universal, we sort of don't allow the sort of obvious, which is that curiosity is not linear. We think about a Wikipedia search, right? I have a question, I click on a link, suddenly I'm like, oh, that's interesting. I ask another question, I click another link, and I go in a number of different directions, right? Sometimes it's path independent. Right? So one version of curiosity. But another version of curiosity is systematic, right? We have a research question and we follow it. And so for Perry and I, we really wanted to allow and facilitate this multiplicity of curiosity. And so that's why we wanted to work with the University of Minnesota Press and the Manifold platform, which is a digital open access platform, such that we could facilitate this form of, I would say, rhizomatic curiosity, right? And I'm just going to share my screen so you can see the website real quickly. It's a beautiful cover. I love the cover of the book. Can you all see? Just shake your head if you can see great. And I'm just showing you the cover here, but what you can notice when you look at the chapter outline is that you can follow the text in any way you want. You don't need to follow it linearly as we sort of imagine reading, right? And that allows you to follow curiosity studies through your own curiosity, as it were. And the second part of that is, if we have to ask the question, how do we enact curiosity? Then curiosity is not singular in terms of its modality either. We don't just always ask oral questions to satiate our curiosity. Sometimes we read and write text. Sometimes we watch films and make films. Right? Sometimes we listen to podcasts and make podcasts, right? And so for us, the Manifold Digital Open Access platform also allows us to think multimodally. So in this case, I'll just click on one that I'm sure. So this is my chapter in the book. And what you'll notice is on the side, we've got a podcast tied to the chapter. And we were lucky enough to work with Lynn Borton, who produces an amazing podcast called Choose to Be Curious, to help us on each of these podcasts that go with each chapter. And so I'll just leave you there with these 3 things. Whose curiosity matters, maybe is the first question, right? 2, how do institutions facilitate or curtail curiosity? And 3, what modes of engagement do we need in order to truly satiate our curiosity? And that's sort of how I think about curiosity studies, and I'll pass it to Perry from there.
Yeah, thanks so Arjun, for the introduction to curiosity studies, and huge thanks to the Mortara Center for hosting this event, to Shiloh for moderating. I do also want to, before I jump into my remarks, recognize that I currently stand on the traditional lands of the Piscataway, the Powhatan, and the Nanticoke peoples, and I want to acknowledge the indigenous people who live and work here today. My remarks are going to be focused on the politics of curiosity, and it's impossible to, I think, responsibly tackle the issue of the politics of curiosity without recognizing the tremendous curtailment of indigenous culture and life and curiosity and wisdom in the United States historically. So I will share my screen as well. And I want to give a little bit of context for my particular chapter in curiosity studies, and then for my forthcoming monograph, Curiosity and Power, which should be out in March. My earliest work in curiosity focused on developing or thinking more closely about modes of curiosity. What are our modes? What are the styles of our curiosity? And that helps to multiply, as Arjun was saying, the kinds of curiosity that we get that can get recognized. And so I did a systematic study of the use of the word curiosity, and specifically the descriptions of curious people in the history of Western thought, especially Western canonical philosophy. And what came up for me over and over again was these three styles of being curious, ways of being curious. The busybody, who's someone who likes to collect lots of different pieces of information, likes to get lots of stories, and isn't particularly focused on any one thing. The hunter, who is focused on one issue, one problem, one question, and really wants to tackle it and problematize it. Say, this is the thing we need to talk about. This is the thing we need to solve. This is the thing we need to focus on. And lastly, the dancer. The dancer is someone who asks questions that are incredibly creative, that says, what if we asked this question instead, or what if we asked it this way instead of that question that way? What if we paired these forms of information that haven't been paired before? What happens then? What could we see that we didn't see before? And these modes of curiosity nicely multiply and expand, again, what strategies or practices of curiosity can get recognized. I've been really lucky to be able to participate in a study and work with psychologist David Lyden-Staley there at the bottom on the left, and network neuroscientist Danielle Bassett on the right, to experimentally test these modes in our contemporary practices of Wikipedia surfing. So we took folks who just spent, an average of 20 minutes a night just browsing Wikipedia. And it's really interesting to see how precisely the hunter and the busybody, there are folks who tend toward one practice or the other practice. So when you're on Wikipedia, do you typically follow links that are really close in constellation to the one that you start with? Or are you somebody who likes to, you read the piece on the entry on octopuses, and then you read something on biochemistry, and then you read something on, environmental climate change, like what is it that that really that just drives your kind of free-ranging curiosity? So it was neat to see that was demonstrated in our Wikipedia browsing practices in general. But what I want to focus on today is the chapter I wrote for Curiosity Studies, which tackles these three modes of curiosity or styles of curiosity as foundational to political resistance movements. So in the chapter, and you can read it, so I won't go into it in too much detail, but I do talk about the civil rights movement. I talk about prison resistance, especially in the 1970s in France, and I talk about an instance of trans and disability activism around bathroom rights. And in each case, I'm trying to centralize that curiosity is a kernel that pushes political resistance forward, and that curiosity is multiple, that there are busybody styles, hunter styles, and dancer styles implicit there. So I'll just take one example, just hang out here on the civil rights movement. And one of the things that you see is that the civil rights movement absolutely practiced a curiosity that collects facts from all kind of corners of experience and of the US in particular. If you read a book called We Charge Genocide, published in 1951, it is a damning manifesto and just a tome, a record of what exactly are the segregation rates in each county and town, what exactly are records of assault, of bombing of Black homes and Black churches, of employment discrimination and housing discrimination. It's just here are all the stories, here are all the facts. And that collecting that was necessary as a foundational moment in the civil rights movement. But that's not enough, right? You have to focus in on a problem and you have to say, look, we need to problematize race, especially anti-Black racism in this country, in a way that has not happened up till now. We need to make it a question. We need to make it a problem. And they did that by public protests and marches and sit-ins and lobbying and a number of other things. But it wasn't just collecting and it wasn't just problematizing, it was also imagining. And we can start with Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, but we can extend far beyond that and really track how the civil rights movement practices imagining a different sort of future, asking different, otherwise seemingly impossible questions about how we are to be with one another. As I thought about the structure of this, curiosity as the kernel of political resistance, though, I thought, it's not just the case that folks, activists on the bottom are really practicing curiosity, but I think they're up against a different sort of curiosity that's institutionalized. And I formalized this in a piece called Curiosities at War, that there's institutionalized curiosity and there's resistant curiosity. Institutionalized curiosity means that during the civil rights movement, for example, people were already collecting news, generating official reports, focusing national policy on recognized problems and envisioning futures, typically for white elites and government elites. But what the civil rights movement was doing was saying, we need to collect different news. We need to collect unofficial reports. We need to refocus national policy, refocus public opinion on previously unrecognized problems, and to re-envision the future by and for people of color, especially Black people here in the US. So there's a tension, there's a war between forms and forces of curiosity that I was seeing here. But it's also important for me. So on the one hand, you say, okay, well, if it's institutionalized, then it's bad. And if it's resistant, then it's good. I mean, how do we figure out what kind of curiosity we want to practice? So I hung out a little bit longer on resistant curiosity, curiosities that are generated from marginalized groups in practices of liberation. And it's more complicated, as things always are. I think that one of the things is that resistant curiosity includes old questions just as much as it includes new questions. We have, I think, a sense that politically resistant curiosity for liberation is always asking a new question, a breaking open, a new future. But I think it's also safeguarding and holding and honoring old questions that just haven't been recognized in the way that they ought to. So if you think about the histories and the literatures of marginalized communities and the canons generated there, the as yet unanswered questions held there, part of what liberation and political resistance work is to honor those things, to return us to those things, rather than to simply press forward into whatever the illusion of the pioneer new is, right? So, and I lean on Gloria Anzaldúa for this, who talks about the very, very first moment of developing critical questions is to take inventory of the questions you've inherited. What are the old questions? Take that inventory. What are the old questions you want to hold on to? What are the new questions you need to ask? And just a little bit of a note on what's coming. So in Curiosity and Power, coming again out in March, here I'm thinking, okay, so it's not just that I have to attend to what's an institutionalized form of curiosity and what's a resistant form of curiosity. It's not just that I have to attend to what's an old question and what's a new question, but I want to think about formations of curiosity that maintain power relations, oppressive power relations. So I talk a lot about curiosity formations, attending to curiosity formations in book Curiosity and Power. And I named two, but I'm sure there are many, many others. One of them is the spectacle erasure formation, where a knower or a curious person makes a spectacle of or objectifies or sometimes fetishizes someone else so as to pay huge attention to them and yet also erase them in the process. And I think about this in relationship to freak shows, for example, especially from a colonized and imperialist perspective, the world fairs similarly, or certain museum cultures as well. And another formation that's important to think about is the access disclosure formation. And this is a formation you can think about sometime when, if someone asks a person of color, well, where are you from? And assumes that they have access to and have a right to that disclosure. Or if a person says to a trans person, you know, so where are you in your transition? Or asks a person with a disability, what's wrong with you? Those moments, that's a particular structure or a formation of curiosity in which the curious person, the asker, assumes direct access and a right to disclosure from someone else, but it maintains this differential of power. How do we resist those? How do we not do those, and how do we do something else? So I finish the book by exploring curious companions, which I directly draw from Christina León. So you're going to be hearing a lot about this in a minute, and I owe much of where I end this book to the conversations that I've had with Christina. But curiosity companions: opacity, ambiguity, and intimacy. And I ask, what would it look like to have a curiosity that is accompanied by a sense of intimacy between the knowers, the knower and the one known, recognizing that there can't be this huge gap or distance between us, but that we are embedded in one another and interrelated with one another? What would it mean for curiosity to be accompanied by ambiguity? Recognizing that I can't always settle, whether I'm this, or you're this, or you're that. You know, there's a complexity to us that cannot be fully simplified and fully decided. Those structures, and I'll leave opacity for Christina, but those structures precisely resist this power relation that's been set up in the spectacle erasure formation or the access disclosure formation, and instead say, no, we're not only on kind of equal footing, but we're interrelated, and our mysteries are entangled with one another. So that's where I'm going. We'll see where else curiosity takes me, but I'll hand it over to Christina.
Thank you, Perry. That was beautiful as usual. Let me get my screen up and make sure that I'm doing this all correctly. Can everybody see that? Yes. Okay. Let me. Okay. So thank you so much. That was beautiful. It's always a wonderful time to be in conversation with Arjun and Perry. Thank you, Shiloh. Thank you, the Mortara Center. Thanks to all of you for being here today when I think all of our attention is worn a little thin and our energies are hopeful and also exhausted. So I really appreciate everyone being here. I want to acknowledge that my institution, Princeton University, is the result of the buildings themselves are the result of enslaved labor, and I want to acknowledge that as entangled with the land that it's on, which is the land of the Lenni Lenape peoples, the indigenous peoples. And I want to linger today on the question of particularly curious entanglements of Latinidad. As you see here, a case for opacity, radical curiosity, and ethical relation. So when I was asked to write a chapter for this beautiful book, I was not as familiar as Arjun and Perry with the sort of historical genealogies of curiosity studies. And it was really a beautiful experiment to think through a long history that kind of finds its apex in the classrooms that I work in. So this history of curiosity is really interesting for me insofar as it is the thing that brings our students into the classroom, and especially classrooms that are dealing with ethnic difference, racialized difference, gendered difference, difference of ability, any marked demographic difference that is somehow readily marked as a demographic is something that's really interesting to me. So I think about this in relation to my contemporary work, which is thinking about opacity, as Perry so beautifully set up for me. So I have some epigraphs here. We clamor for the right to opacity for everyone. This is a citation from Edward Glissant, who was a Caribbean philosopher and thinker from Martinique, and he wrote Poetics of Relation. Then there's this wonderful political scientist that I think resonates so forcefully as we see numbers coming in right now. Characterizing a subject as either Hispanic or Latino is an exercise in opacity. And I think that that is something that pollsters are dealing with en masse right now. And what's interesting with Beltran is that she's saying this in relation to what she calls the trouble with unity in Latinx politics, the trouble with thinking that this pan-ethnic amalgamation of 500 years of colonization with differentials along the lines of race and gender, indigeneity, displacement could actually mean the same thing, right? And then the last quote is from Nicolas de Villiers, who says, "I would like to allow for the possibility of non-meaning and non-knowledge as queer strategies. This is what I'm calling queer opacity." And so in my work, I'm thinking through how opacity might be an ethically attendant term to curiosity. And what I mean by that is that one of the things that we struggle with in classrooms that are dealing specifically with named difference and representation. So in my case, in English classrooms where I'm teaching any form of minority literature, there's an imperative for our students to come in as good multicultural actors. And insofar as they're doing that, they're actually foreclosing a relation with the texts that they're reading. And what I mean by that is that they're anticipating that they need to have one comportment, one form of curiosity in relation to specific demographics. And often that means that they're trying to quickly extract meaning to get some sort of sociological data to tell them, you know, this particular novel tells me that Latinx peoples do this. And one novel is never enough. One story is never enough, right? One month, one tribute month is never enough. So this is a little bit of the concern that I have, but at the same time, we want our students to come in with that curiosity. We just don't want that curiosity to be curtailed by many, many, many years of taxonomic difference that come to us from colonial practices, right? From practices that would taxonomize the world according to one vantage point, right? So that then the kind of engagement with difference is quite fast versus the way we might engage with a text by Shakespeare or Baudelaire. So this is the kind of recurring question I have. So I'm worried, as we all are. And so Dora Summer has a beautiful quote here: "Worry should be part of the work if we learn to read the distance written into some ethnically marked literature. A variety of rhetorical moves can hold a reader at arm's length or joke at their pretense of master in order to propose something different than knowledge." So one of the things I'm thinking through with Dora Summer, particularly with minority literatures in the Americas, is thinking through how these literatures should actually unmoor us, right? They should undo our thinking that we know ahead of time what we're going to read if we know the sort of identificatory demographic of the author. Another person I'm thinking, for some reason, I'm having a real issue with technology lately that I'm rerouting. Another person I'm thinking with here also comes from Latinx Studies, Antonio Viego. And this to me has been a quote I come back to on a regular basis. And again, I think it's one that resounds in the echo chambers as we see the data rolling in from voting patterns, particularly around Latinx peoples. "There must be much less pretension to understanding in this regard, since ethnic racialized subjectivity has suffered from too much understanding. This is not to say that ethnic racialized subjectivity and experience has been understood, but rather to say that the project of understanding is imagined completely within reach." And so that paradoxical relationship for me about understanding is really important. When I think with Glissant in particular, when he says we clamor for the right to opacity for everyone, he's saying that when we're asking for the right to opacity for everyone, we're actually asking for them not to be grasped, so that your knowledge practices or your reading practices are not grasping, but rather are being in relation to that difference. And this, and Glissant here says, the thrust of the world and its desire no longer embolden you onward in a fever of discovery. They multiply you all around. So another, perhaps glib and funny way to think about this is that how do you encounter difference without turning yourself into Christopher Columbus, right? As every time I read this quote, I'm thinking about how much we use terms like discovery, pioneering, spearheading, all of these terms that are incredibly colonial to think about the purchase of knowledge. And what might it be if knowledge actually doesn't sediment your subject position in relation to what you're learning or what you're reading, but actually multiplies the possibilities of who you might be and where it resonates with others. So opacity for me is this incredibly rich term because it's not, it's a visual term, but it's a term that resists thinking that visuality gives us the whole story. As we've moved from a lettered society to a more visual society, and as we see our students being so adept at doing visual sort of analysis, we need to think a little bit more about the ways in which we think that visibility itself is the means and ends to political change. And so opacity for me is a really interesting term to think with visual culture. Not to say that simply getting more brown and black bodies in the room will change the room, right? But rather that the room's architecture has to change more profoundly than simply that. Another way to think about this too, alongside some of the points that Perry had brought up with the kind of curious practices that people have with difference, like why is it that marked bodies always get stared at, always get put under the microscope, always get asked to give an account of themselves? How does this become a form of policing in our knowledge practices? And so for me, opacity is not full occlusion, it's not full negativity, it's not a complete withdrawing from the visual field or the field of knowledge, but there's a recalcitrance, there's a textured resistance. And to me, this keeps opacity as an ethically attendant term that allows curiosity to be rhizomatic, to be undisciplined, to have the possibility of moving outside of our institutional sort of pathways. So again, I'm back to Glissant, and I am a very citational person because that was how I was trained. And I also just find that the texture of words to be something that helped me think in concert. So in Poetics of Relation, Glissant says, we've done a really good job of thinking about difference in the 20th century, but this theory of difference is important, right? We need to understand that race, class, gender, ability, citizen status, whether or not you're incarcerated, all of these things will profoundly affect your life chances and the way in which you're read in the world. But that difference can still contrive to reduce things to the transparent. So by that, he means if we take these terms for granted, then we're actually not allowing those terms to be radically different, and we're not allowing ourselves to be radically curious about those differences. He says opacities can coexist and converge, weaving fabrics. To understand these, one must focus on the texture of the weave and not the nature of its components. And for me, this is such a beautiful citation because then we're thinking about differences as converging and departing from one another. We're thinking about the sensorial relationship between different formations rather than taxonomizing the components, rather than trying to find one thread, diagnosing what it is, putting it in a drawer, and never really attending it to it again. So I think about this a lot in the classroom, and I'm thinking about this a lot as I'm wrapping up my book project right now, particularly because I think one of the things that's been occurring to me as I work through this chapter, and I have to say that Arjun and Perry really helped me to more firmly try to understand the quagmire that faces marked demographics in relation to representation. I'm really thinking about the fact that opacity for me is a way in which we can humble our pretense to mastery. We can stay in relation to unfolding political dilemmas and quagmires without having to move past them. And we can also afford our students so much when we allow the classroom to be a place where they don't have to have a mastery of knowledge, where they don't have to come in with a set of answers, but where we might be helping them to refine questions themselves, right? And so this would take us away from the sage on stage model of top-down learning and more into a textured relationship with our students where we're co-creating conversations and questions that can take us hopefully into kinder and more entangled futures. So I will end there and say thank you so much. Arjun?
I'm ready. Let me just share my screen and then we'll get started. So thank you all for sticking around to this point. I'm going to try to keep these comments brief. I'm first going to say that, I'm going to give a trigger warning here because we're dealing with mental health and in some cases suicide. So if those things are triggering, just be aware. But so in my chapter in this book, I had been working through a particular dilemma. So let me give you some context here about how I was thinking about curiosity. About 7 years ago, I started getting really interested in student mental health, student mental unwellness on college campuses, really thinking particularly about stress, anxiety, depression, and suicidal ideation. And this started for me when I was at the University of Pennsylvania because really tragically, we experienced a suicide cluster, meaning we had about, I think at that time it was 14 students in 5 years who had taken their own lives, right? And so that became a crisis for the campus and became a crisis for the administration at the University of Pennsylvania, who was trying to figure out what to do. And their solution, which in some ways made sense, was to just open up more counseling facilities, more hours for students to go to get therapy. And so the logic there was, okay, there's students who are unwell. After the fact, we need to, after they are unwell, we need to get them help. So the problem at that point was about the student. And we didn't really question, or the administration didn't question, the learning environment in which the students were participating. So I had this sort of juggling in my head, this problem about student mental health as I moved to Hamilton College in upstate New York, which is a small liberal arts college, again, with maybe a similar demographic to Georgetown students. And again, the same thing happened. There were multiple suicides in a single year as soon as I landed on the ground. And I thought, okay, I really have to think more about student mental health. It's happening not just at the University of Pennsylvania, but clearly this is a cross American university problem. And so myself and a few students got together to start thinking about how we might study this issue of student mental health. And one of those students in particular really struck me. It was a student named Adam who had taken one of my classes, and the first day he came into my office hours, he was ready to talk about student mental unwellness. Like from the very moment I met him. Right? He said he was candid about the fact that he had experienced depression and suicidal ideation in his second year in college, that he had to take a year off because of that, but now he was back. And he was thinking about why that happened to him. And the sentence he kept repeating from that moment was that the campus was sick, that it wasn't necessarily just him that was sick, but a whole slew of students who may or may not have been diagnosed with a mental illness, right? But still were experiencing high levels of stress, anxiety, depression because of the learning environment of their institution. And so this is sort of the organizing principle that got me and these other students on campus to start asking new questions about why students are feeling so unhealthy. And because Adam was recognizing that this was environmental, it was social, right? It was political and economic, and not just about the individual person, we started thinking about what practices, policies, and cultural values were producing all this sickness on campus. And that's sort of what's going to lead me into the kind of hypothesis and then and sort of findings we came to together. And what I'm going to argue here today, and what I argue in the book, is that one way, at least one aspect of mental unwellness in the student body has to do with the way that capitalist values have structured what kinds of questions students can ask, right? We know very well that students coming in are generally extremely anxious about grades, achievement, success, jobs after college, right? And one thing we found almost across the students we talked to was that this really curtailed their curiosity. They felt like they had to or ought to ask particular questions, and therefore weren't following their passions or interests in many cases. So it was a literal tearing from themselves, which led them down this road to experiencing particular kinds of unwellness. And so let me give you a little more context there. History. Some of my students, I don't know if they're in the crowd, but they always know that I'm talking about historical contingency all the time. And that's to say that this experience of student unwellness on campus is not a long-standing one. It's actually relatively new, and it has to do with the university as a place of the debt economy. Anybody who goes to college now knows that going to college, especially a private college like Hamilton or like Georgetown or like University of Pennsylvania, where I was, is expensive. Right? And that's happened especially since the 1980s, but after 2000 in particular. So students are already focused on the fact that they're in debt, right? At the moment when they're starting to ask questions about what they should learn and what they should do next. And that's happening at the same time that after the 1980s, there's a rise of STEM, meaning science, technology, engineering, management, right? Finance, economics, because those are highly valued in terms of career advancement and economic mobility, which is curtailing other institutional apparati, gender studies, ethnic studies, women's studies, all of which are actually asking us to question the knowledge we're getting in the university, right? Asking us to question who should be curious about what and why. And so this is all happening at the same time. And you can see, therefore, that also this is going to privilege a particular kind of masculinist, white version of curiosity, right? Which is maybe post-racial in some way because it's about STEM. And so students in this context are asking some very, very clear questions, and it makes sense, right? If you're in debt and if STEM is where we're going to make some money, we want to know, how do I get a job? What courses do I need to take? How do I get the grades I need? Who do I need to know? It's about networking in a lot of cases, right? And how do I get a leg up on the competition? And this idea of competitive drive came up quite a bit, right? I need to win a particular kind of race against my fellow students, which again is a very masculinist way of thinking about learning, right? I learn by defeating somebody else rather than I learn in collectivity through relationship. So I was curious about how the students experienced this, right? This commodification of curiosity is what we might call that, where all curiosity is only about career advancement and job advancement. So I talked to one of my students, Michael, really, really sharp kid, and he sort of told me from the very beginning that of course he knew about curiosity's commodification, because the first time he ever read about curiosity was in recruiter.com when he was trying to get a job. It's like, okay, so that's the only way we can imagine curiosity, right? As pushing us towards jobs. But when I asked him how he felt about it, he just told me that's life. And there was no ability to question this problem of, is this how we should ask questions? Instead, it was a taken for granted assumption that curiosity had to be towards job creation. But Michael was also very sharp, and eventually, when I got him to think about this a little more, he admitted that it wasn't just about him, but it was about the institution. He talked a lot about the Career Center, about the fact that he felt like he had to get an internship, had to get a job, had to pick a career right when he got set foot on the college campus. And what he said, and I've emphasized in this quote, is that this pressure creates the fatalist and pragmatic individual. So the pragmatic part is that's life, right? But the fatalist part is the experience, right? Which he didn't necessarily call a form of mental unwellness, but a fatalist individual is someone who may or may not be more unwell, right, than he otherwise could be. He's not thriving. But Michael was sort of like, that's my perspective. You should go talk to John, right? John was a good friend of his. And he thought John would totally challenge my whole hypothesis about curiosity and commodification because John was a musician, right? He was a guitar player who really was going to follow his passions. He wasn't going to go the normal sort of corporate path. He was going to be a creative, and he was an incredibly creative person. So I talked to John about this. He tells me stories about what he's going to do, and I just listen and I just listen. He keeps going. And finally, at some point in the conversation, he tells me, almost as an aside, but it's important, but I still have marketable skills. So this idea of having to justify a career as a musician by saying, but I still have marketable skills, shows that the student who wants to follow their passions, follow their curiosity, is by nature feels at risk, right? The only way you can not feel at risk is if you follow what you ought to do, which is a STEM field where you can have a relatively risk-free career, right, in economic mobility. And the last person I'll talk about before I end here is Charlotte. And Charlotte, I love this quote because Charlotte again talks about her own sort of experiences of mental unwellness in relationship to the idealized student. And there's the ideal Hamilton student at Penn. There was Penn Face, which was again an idealized student, which was always about doing more. Less sleep, competition. More positions, competition. Most time at the library, competition. Everything takes on this particular kind of busyness, which doesn't allow students to just ask questions, right? Idle curiosity doesn't exist on many campuses. And what Charlotte freely admits at the end is that this had paralyzed her. Literally that emotion of paralysis, because she feels like she had to do so much and yet always felt like she may do something wrong. And so the fear of failure also ends up being part of the problem of commodification of curiosity. We can't take risks if we aren't willing to ask questions that fall out of what might allow us career advancement. And I'll just end there by asking a question which I hope drives our discussion, which is, what would university life look like if we were really focused on student curiosity and all of its flourishing, right? All of its possibility and multiplicity. I think this moment with the pandemic and the election has forced us to reckon with maybe some fundamental questions about our society and what we're learning. And I'm seeing that in my classroom. So I would love to hear, from the students as well about how they're seeing how their curiosities might be changing. And I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Great. This is back to Shiloh. I just wanted to thank our panelists for these really evocative comments. We have the opportunity now to open it up to the audience for any questions. If you want to use in the bottom of the screen is the Q&A function. If you click on that, you can post a question. Please keep it to a concise question as much as possible in order to allow as many to pop into the queue. And I will keep my eye on this. We have a couple already. I think I'll just quickly ask across all the panelists, if you might say a few quick words about, you've all sort of touched on challenges to the sort of university system. And I'm wondering if, in some respect, and I'm wondering if you might just quickly say a little bit about the interdisciplinary challenges of the more resistant, multivalent, decolonial kind of curiosity studies that you're talking about. to the kind of liberal conventions and foundations of a lot of institutions and university and curriculum, and sort of the kinds of pedagogical reconfigurations that you see, right, that might move us toward that, especially as a lot of these liberal conventions are also simultaneously under attack. The problem of liberalism, anyone?
Maybe I can just start this off for us. I'll often have this conversation with my students, right, when we're talking about, we're not necessarily always couching it in the terms of curiosity, but we're talking about it generally in the terms of engagement, right? And I say, okay, a liberal impulse is to say that all sides matter all the time, right? This sort of both sidesism. And then we pose the question, well, okay, if one side thinks racism is bad and the other side thinks racism is good, right? Are these legitimate starting points for a conversation or a set of questions? Clearly not, right? One of the things about a radical curiosity is it requires an attention to specificity, right? It requires an attention to facts, as Perry is saying, history, so that the kinds of questions we ask are not merely sort of surface, right? Opinion is another way of saying that, but is based on an enthusiastic way of being open to something new. And I was thinking also, another way of saying this is a thing about Narendra Keval's chapter in our text, which talks about the difference between racial curiosity and racist curiosity. A racist curiosity asks questions, right? We say X, Y, and Z, but it's always to reinforce the fact, always to reinforce a racist trope. There's no openness to change. A racial curiosity might still ask questions about where you're from, et cetera, which on its surface might feel racist. But if we're open to a challenge to our point of view, then it's productive, right? And so that's another way of thinking about the problem with a liberal impulse. Those two things are not the same and should not be treated equally.
Great. We have a question for Perry. Could you elaborate more about the spectacle erasure aspect of your analysis?
Sure. The spectacle erasure formation involves when someone's curiosity makes a spectacle of somebody else. So that means hyper visibilizes another person, another culture, an object from another place, and yet erases or refuses the deep contextual and historical and cultural meaning of that person, culture, or object. So it's this really slippery thing that seems to be paying amazing amount of attention and yet no attention at all. And in fact, refusing to respond to the specificity of that person or that thing. And I think for two really nice examples actually appear in Christina's chapter. So I might just pitch it to you, Christina. I was thinking of the Norton anthology and the work of Ana Mendieta. I don't know if you want to sort of play that out for us.
Sure, yeah. Well, one of the things that's really interesting about the way in which literary history happens is that it follows silos. So maybe this also kind of comes back to Shiloh's question around liberal institutions. Liberal institutions like to silo and separate, and they rest upon a taxonomy that is not one we really want to inherit. So I think there's a way in which radical curiosity can demand an interdisciplinarity that is very unruly and almost intimidating, but that's the pedagogical challenge I think that's so cool about teaching. It makes you incredibly honest, which I think is a beautiful thing. With the faces, with curiosity, one of the things that's been interesting in the time that I've been tracking the way in which Latinx identities and lives are rendered is often through a panoply of faces. Either demographic faces, right? These are the numbers we're going to see, and then media predictions based off of a flattened notion of those faces, right? So that you have these numbers, these faces, and they all mean the same thing, we can predict according to that. And as we've seen over as many election cycles as you've been attentive to the question of Latinidad or migration, those optics fracture, right? And so one of the performance artists that I work on the Mendieta, I should have had some of my work handy for you, but she had come from Cuba in the 1960s, after there had been another Red Scare, right? A previous Red Scare to the one we're in right now. And there was a enforced migration of a lot of unaccompanied minors from Cuba to the United States. And so when she moved from Cuba to the United States, what also moved is her frame of reference. She became brown, whereas in Cuba, she had been white. And so she was taken into orphanages, and her early artwork is taking her face in plexiglass and smashing the plexiglass against her face. This became a way for me to think about the violence of curious gazes that have that power differential that Perry had so beautifully articulated, where the impact of the curiosity is incredibly violent. And what became so uncanny about looking at these photos of her is that it does disfigure what we see. So I think I'll just end there. Thanks.
Great. We have another question I think that any panelists might want to address, which is, in what ways do you think that the freedom to be curious is a privilege? For instance, impoverished people may have to orient their curiosity toward a career to survive.
I mean, Arjun, that feels like pretty close to your attention to capital. But I do want to say just really briefly that I think assuming that one of the dangers is to assume that if you don't have privilege, that you can't be curious or that you aren't curious. And that, I think that's an illusion that is perpetrated actually from above, and that we need to attend to. How does curiosity look there? What does it look like when it is, okay, career driven, but when it's not? So what other forms of curiosity are being practiced and imagined in communities that lack certain privileges? I think that's what we need to attend to. But
maybe I'll just sort of look at Nicholas's question differently and think about the question of freedom, right? And freedom is, again, just like curiosity, not a transparent word. Right? I think one way of thinking about freedom is the sort of choice model that comes out of neoliberal capitalist regime. We sort of imagine that as long as we give people a choice, even if those choices are obviously constrained, right, by their particular material conditions, that's fine. That's good enough. So I would say first we have to think about freedom, and then I'll just say that I agree with Perry. When we think about curiosity as singular is when we get into this problem of different people not having curiosity or having curiosity, right? But just because certain forms of curiosity are overvalued, right, and overdetermine what it is that gives us power, doesn't mean that curiosity is not existing all around us in ways that we sometimes don't even see. Right, and that I think is a huge problem.
We have a question, Christina, maybe you want to address this from Audrey. How do we take collective action in order to address this opacity of different identities?
That's a great question. Thank you. One of the things I've been thinking about recently is I've been revisiting a lot of Black feminist theory, and specifically the Combahee River Collective statement from 1969, I believe. And one of the things that I think is really important to put pressure on is the term identity, to sort of pick up on a move or a pivot that Arjun made. I think it's really important when we're thinking about the opacity of different identities, to not take the identities for granted, and to also remember that the folks who came up with the term identity politics in the Combahee River Collective were Black, feminist, working class, laboring class, lesbians. And they weren't saying that our identities are the most important thing or the only optic, but rather they were saying, if we can be curious about our emplacements, about our sociopolitical context, and how those are interlocking forms of oppression, then we can begin to imagine a coalitional politics. And so I think what's really beautiful about that model is that it is not that identity is determinative of your politics, but it's that in order to start understanding your relation to political coalition and possibility, you have to imagine within that entangled space. And so a lot of the work that the Combahee River that came out of the Combahee River Collective didn't look like necessarily the issues that would be directly related to Black lesbian lives, right? So they would be marching for reproductive freedom, or they would be at, they would go to perhaps like a white working class picket line and help with that union strike. And so I think the question of identity is important, but I think we can have a curious politics that intersects with it without having that identitarian term over-determining the sort of possibilities of paths forward. So I hope that answers that question.
We just had a question come in about, especially since we're on Zoom here, how can we reconcile the desire to find a texture difference with the world of the digital classroom, where the literal texture of touch is eliminated, yet students are still always rendered transparent by the university?
That's a beautiful question. Since I say texture difference a lot, I'll just say that even though we are in conversation over this flattened screen, I've found that students are still bringing quite a lot of their sensorial and not just knowledge-based, not just learning-based questions, but their passions are really emerging in Zoom classrooms because of the constriction of where they are in their lives. And so I've been really incredibly emboldened and impressed by my students' ability to come and to wrestle with really difficult questions, almost more so in this space than I've seen in physical classrooms, even as much as I miss being in a physical classroom as a person who gets like migraines very easily from Zoom, you know? I would say that touch is not always physical. The very fact that our senses trigger other senses is really important to remember. So that might be one way of answering that beautiful question, but I wanted to hear other folks.
Yeah, I might also just add the complexity of Zoom. Yes, the flattening, yes, the seemingly detexturization, but at the same time, the reality that we're all typically in each other's homes, and you see how we surround ourselves and how we kind of embed ourselves in our space, and it's that richness that actually comes into the Zoom session in a way that in a typical classroom it's far more sanitized and far more abstracted and extracted. You know, we're all just kind of planted there in the most boring of places, it seems, and then expected to, you know, get to know each other. So there's something, I don't know, there's a lot happening with the shift to Zoom.
Maybe I'll cut in here for a couple questions I think that are largely directed to Arjun about let's see, sort of thinking about the role of that the professor might have in mediating the impact of the capitalist dampening of curiosity, and thus hopefully better mental health. And there's also a question here about to what extent does STEM play in a role in making the model of the minority static? So, you know, different questions, but sort of kind of related to some of your comments.
Maybe I'll backdoor it to those questions. The first thing I'll say is that just picking up on Christina and Perry, I think there's something about Zoom that that's really important insofar as flattening might not always be bad. And what I mean by that is when we have a history with classroom dynamics. The history of classroom dynamics at its most basic, in its most basic sense, is teacher-student, right? Teacher standing, students sitting, right? There's a way that that power dynamic plays out in every single relation. And we work really hard to break that if we imagine ourselves as good pedagogues or something like that, right? But on Zoom, it automatically blows that up, right? We're looking at each other and it feels flattened. And it does feel like a different set of conversations are possible because of that, right? So that's like sort of starting this problem of the teacher and the professor. The second problem of the professor, the STEM ones I'm going to come to last because that's actually the most complicated in some ways. But the thing that I say at the end of my particular chapter, at least, and I think which kind of undergirds a lot of what we're saying here, is that hope matters. And the belief that one can change your environment matters. And the first place that a student, for example, has the opportunity to actually enact that is in a classroom, right? If the professor has the ability to work with them in that way, right? So in our sort of undynamic, worst case scenario, the teacher is just telling the student everything they ought to learn and therefore stultifying them even further, right? Using Paulo Freire's very classical term, right? Stultifying, literally pushing knowledge into their brains such that they can't enact any change themselves. Right? There's another model of the classroom which actually imagines that we're all changing the classroom together, which is what I think Christina was really getting at in her presentation too, right? And says that actually, no, in this classroom, you can change what the syllabus looks like, right? You can change what we're learning and what our outcomes should be, objectives. And that actually is powerful. And in this classroom, we can also figure out what else we need to change. And so at least in my freshman program, a lot of it is about also to try to remind ourselves that nothing is static. I think in this racial worldview that has become the most dominant worldview, whether we realize it or not, everything is always as it has been, right? But actually everything is not always as it has been. Most things have only been enacted in the last 250 years, right? If not in the last 50 years, if not in the last 30 years. So let's understand those historical contingencies, those very human decisions that at least allow us to understand that we can maybe change. So that's the second point. Maybe I should stop though, because the STEM one's going to take a long time. So I will leave that for somebody else.
We also have a couple more questions, so we could keep that in mind. One of them is it's directed specifically at the culture and politics program, but I'm going to riff slightly. I'm going to move it out of the kind of specificity. So culture and politics as a major is an interdisciplinary self-design major that operates in what the questioner, Julia, says is a highly regimented curriculum with so many requirements. So the question is sort of, does that location inside of something so incredibly regimented then actually facilitate curiosity? Or, you know, is it having kind of an opposite effect in terms of the kind of more radical decolonial critique that might be possible? I mean, I see that as a question about like the position of proximity of critique to that which one is resisting, right? So Culp would be considered to be right inside of something it's very resistant toward as a knowledge production curriculum and school. And so I wonder if you might have quick comments then, sort of my riff on the question, opening it out in terms of critique and proximity to that which one is critiquing.
Yeah, it has some resonances, I think, to the opening question about interdisciplinarity and from the freedom of that. And I think there is a sense in which more and more disciplinary restrictions or conditions for a major seem to suppress curiosity, and the anti-disciplinary force of curiosity studies insists, no, we need to all be talking to each other and reading widely and reading in some sense indiscriminately. But at the same time, I would insist on the complexities of history. So if you dig deeply into any one field's histories, you're going to find just about as much tension and give and elasticity and complexity. And so I would not, I am excited when I get outside of my field, and I'm excited when I get really deeply inside of my field, because in both cases, it just kind of cracks open if you're really attentive there. So I don't know if that's an answer, but that's what was made me thinking about.
Great. There's another question here, and maybe this is a good one potentially to kind of move to wrap up, which is how do you believe we might go about legitimizing on a larger scale differing forms of curiosity and the community grassroots knowledge that stems from alternative approaches to curiosity and pedagogy?
I might just take that up for a second. I think that, well, I think one community grassroots, any kind of community or grassroots movement, I think often is a practice of curiosity, and in the sense that it's really caring about the community from a ground up perspective. And that means having local engagement, but it also means having imagination about how that ground itself might shift. And I think you can see this a lot in actually both Arjun and Perry's work at the level of the classroom, also at the level of different political movements that have harnessed the power of questioning and dialogue in a community. And I think that it requires both an attention to the speed of crisis that we're in, but also a consistent effort to slow down and to actually have conversations and to have dialogues. So it takes us out of a certain technocracy around political change and would have us actually, speaking slowly, asking questions, and making sure that we are actually in a viable and vibrant relation with one another, rather than assuming that because we're part of one organization or one movement, we know where we're going. I'll end there.
Great.
I'm going to pick up right where Christina left off, which is, and maybe make it tangible to our classroom syllabi. So one of the things that I know we're thinking about a lot at SFS is with this global anti-racism initiative is our syllabi and who we're reading on our syllabi. In some ways, that's seems almost too obvious, but who we're reading legitimizes or delegitimizes different kinds of knowledge, right, by its very nature. So that's one piece of it. The second thing that we're doing a lot in my classroom, at least, is to think about data, right? And to think about what kinds of data is valorized. This goes again back to Christina, what you were saying about in some ways quantification, in which we no longer see the human beings involved, versus qualitative research. And why is it that we're valorizing quantitative ways of seeing the world to such an extent that we can't even see other forms of knowledge? Right? Not to say that quantification is bad in and of itself, but when it's overvalued is when it becomes harmful, right? As any sort of dogmatic knowledge does. And by the way, I think that's the problem with STEM as well. The problem with STEM is that rather than thinking about difference rigorously and really leaning into the problems of race, class, gender, sexuality, and saying, no, these exist, but they exist in complex ways. We don't want to touch that at all, right? We want to live in a world where the technocratic move, right, where the abstract move, where anything that doesn't deal with difference is the way to solve the problem for everybody. And that's what I think curiosity studies, especially as I think Perry and I have thought about it, refuses by its very nature.
Yeah, and I would just add that I do think that I think that Arjun, your diagnosis of STEM can certainly hold in most cases, and yet I do want to flag some really remarkable work that's being done by scientists of color and in the field that is, I think, changing the level of attentiveness to things like race and ethnicity and gender. But I would just flag at the very end here that I think one of the big things for me is to try to think about curiosity outside of an ableist perspective. And so that one of the communities that I am specifically trying to attend to and to be in conversation with is a disability community. And what does it mean, especially for people, if they use the language of mental illness, or people who struggle with anxiety and depression, or people who have different learning styles, or who are neuroatypical or autistic? What does it mean? How does curiosity look? How is it practiced? And how might people in the university specifically break their attachment to something we might call an ableist curiosity, an able-bodied, able-minded curiosity that functions in very relatively established and disciplinary ways? So that's, for me, that's a live question that I'm sort of tackling lately.
Great. We're at time, I think, about 1:15. I really want to thank our panelists very much for an extraordinary set of presentations, really fascinating, evocative comments, and also for the Curiosity Studies volume, very exciting. Thanks again to the Mortara Center and the Cole program, and thanks to everyone who attended. Take care, stay safe and well.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.